everybody, depending on where you are, perhaps somewhere else within those time spaces. My name is Sarah Pink. I'm the Director of the Emerging Technologies Research Lab at Monash University, and I'm also the Director of the Smart Homes for Senior film, which we're going to be screening tonight. So I'm delighted to welcome you. I'd like to begin by respectively asking you to acknowledge the Wurundjeri and Bunurong peoples of the Kulin Nation, who are the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which I, and many of you also, will be meeting from tonight, and to pay respect to their elders past, present and emerging. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which all of you are located today, and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this celebration. So the reason for us meeting this evening is to view and discuss the film Smart Homes for Seniors, a documentary film, which has been a very special project, both for me and the whole research team who worked on it with me. The film brings forward, I think, our commitments and the emotion that the project actually held for all of us and for the participants in the film and the project as well. My first thanks, as always, are to the people who participate in research, and hence the people who participate in the film, who will be meeting later this evening or this morning. Since without any of them, none of this would have been possible at all, not the research project or the film itself. So many thanks to the seniors who agreed to participate in the project and in the film. I hope some of you are here watching. But I also want to acknowledge the depth and the breadth of the teamwork that's actually been behind this film and the whole project itself. This film is one of the outcomes of an Intelligent Home Solutions for Independent Living project. This was led by our partner organisation, McLean Care, with Sue Thompson and Alicia Eugene of Harvest Consulting. And it was undertaken by two academic teams, our design ethnography team at Monash University, Yolandi Strangers, Melissa Duque, Rex Martin, Larissa Nichols and myself, and the technical team from Deakin University, Michael Mortimer and Ben Horan. This project was an opportunity for us to undertake and now share with you a uniquely collaborative project. It was interdisciplinary. It brings together social, technical and industry partners in a whole new way. Now, as well as the film, the project created a Smart Homes for Seniors website and a detailed report. And they're all accessible through the intelligenthomesolutions.com.au website. So that's Intelligent Home Solutions, all one word, .com.au. And so you can find many more of the materials from the project there if you're interested to follow up. And now the Smart Homes for Seniors film was also made under pandemic circumstances. As you'll see, we started our research just before the lockdowns happened. We meant to return. We were going to go back to meet the participants again and to film again in New South Wales. That wasn't possible. And I also have to say that I'm extremely grateful to the outstanding filmmaker, Kit Williams, who produced and edited the film with us, without being able to return to New South Wales to film with us. So to end then, the Emerging Technologies Lab's ambition is to do the best possible academic work, to develop unique interdisciplinary collaborations, and to create partnerships with industry, with not-for-profit, with policy and other organisations. We want our research to benefit diverse people and communities in Australia and internationally. And documentary film is part of how we achieve this. So first, I'd like to introduce our three fantastic panellists, who I'm absolutely delighted to have all three of you here. And I'd like to thank you all for getting up early in the morning in Europe and the UK to be able to join us. First, I'd like to introduce Rama Geruau. Now, Rama is the director of the Helen Hamlin Centre for Design at the Royal College of Art, where he's a reader in inclusive design. Now, Rama is an international figure within design. He won a Design Week Hall of Fame award in 2019 and was named a 2018 Creative Leader by the Creative Review alongside Paul Smith and Bjork. Now, addressing diversity across age, ability, gender and race, he's a serial innovator in the field of inclusive design and design thinking. He's led over 100 international projects with government, business, academia, and the third sector. And his clients include Samsung, Toyota, and Panasonic. So welcome, Rama. Now I'd like to introduce Professor Anne Light. Anne is Professor of Design and Creative Technology at the University of Sussex in the UK and Professor of Interaction Design, Social Change and Sustainability at Malmö University in Sweden. Now, Anne Light is a world-renowned researcher. So working at University of Sussex and Malmö University as a professor of design, she's interested in how people relate to each other in contemporary society and the impact of present and future design choices. And she's looked particularly at the lives of older people over many years. Anne specialises in participatory practice and the social impact of technology. And she brings a background which is quite unique in the arts, humanities, AI, and human-computer interaction to bear an innovation in social process, culture, and well-being. So welcome, Anne. And finally, I'd like to welcome Professor Elisa Giacardi. Elisa is Professor and Chair of Post-Industrial Design and Director of Design for Interaction, the MSc programme, in the Faculty of Industrial Design Engineering, Delft University of Technology. Now, in her role at Delft University of Technology, Elisa leads the Connected Everyday Lab. Her work focuses on the challenges that permeating digitalization means for design. So from early digital networks and social media to IoT and AI, her interests reflect a persistent concern with design as a shared process of cultivation and management of opportunity spaces, and also the transformative role that technology can play. Elisa is a pioneer of meta-design, network and open design processes, and she explores how modern digital things participate in design and use in ways previous industrially produced objects could not. So I'm so delighted that all three of you are joining us for this discussion. I have a series of 3 discussion points and questions that I'd like to pose to all of you. And if you'd like to answer in the order in which I introduced you, so Rama, Anne, and then Elisa, then that will make sure that we stay organised. So my first question, if the story that we seek to tell in the film, does that resonate with your own experience as a researcher or designer? And also, what insights did you draw from the film about seniors and design? So Rama, would you like to kick off for us?
Great, thank you. And it's a great pleasure to be here. And just to give a short visual description of myself, I represent as male. I have dark brown skin, black hair, a short black beard. I'm wearing a white shirt with a plum-colored top, which matches my wall. And I hope that you all appreciate how much planning that took. And I'm sitting on a grey sofa. So the film really resonated because over the last sort of 10, 15 years, you see a different relationship between people across the life stages and attitudes to technology, more acceptance to rely on technology, sometimes rather than family members. We see in people that sometimes are described as the younger old. They would rather lean into a technological solution than, always ringing up a neighbor or a family member. But I think the thing that really came out to me as a heartbeat was the humanity of the film, the movie, even within a pandemic, that reaching out across through tech, beyond tech, around tech, and the multivarious attitudes that we have to tech. Tech is not seen as a great enabler or disabler, but it's many things in between. So those things really, really resonated to me. And I think the final point was just some of the wittiness, some of the humanity. So there were many points where I was smiling, where people were finding workarounds, where I don't know if you edited out any curse words or swear words at the technology, Sarah, but you sort of felt that there was this level of human engagement, which I think is another challenge for us as designers and technologists to enable. At what point does that robot become part of the family? At what point, there was a little interaction with a pet, where the pet was trying to ignore it. And you just start to think, how can that technology step from beyond the walls of the home or the surface tops or the hard kind of plastic product opportunity and into the softer fabric of life. So that was my immediate reaction.
Thanks, Rama. Those are wonderful comments. And yes, I mean, that kind of emotional dimension to the film was really, and to the whole project was central for us. I think we all cried the first time we saw it, because I think the feelings were really powerful. So I'll turn over to you now, Anne.
Hello, and I think in the spirit of description, I should say that the particularly salient points here are that I'm the person with white skin and grey hair here, and I'm also the person who has my reading glasses on my head, because I can't watch that film without putting them on to see the detail. But I want to say I thought it was lovely storytelling. I really want to commend the lightness of touch here, because it can be such a challenge capturing all those different aspects that you managed to bring in. And my overriding sense was, I want a Ross, because here is somebody who comes in and makes my world work. And I think that for me, that's something which is really important here, because you capture that, some of the challenges of use. And I was really struck, even from the first example, when you have the medicine light going on, you've got this kind of thing that suddenly enters people's world and contributes an extra dimension. And I really like the fact that here is somebody who's being described as a senior kind of, and the assumption is that people are going to forget their medicine. And she's going, oh, that's going to protect the youngsters. And I just loved that inversion there. But it also made me think about how, as that regime changes and they need different medicine, perhaps at a different time, that it's not just about use. And for me, one of the big challenges that I've seen, not just for people who might describe themselves as senior, wherever that starts, but actually for all of us, is how we make this stuff accessible in the design, in the kind of way that we create our environments. So I'm quite good still at moving around furniture, and that may be something that the people we've been watching are less good at. But I still find it really challenging to work out what kind of programming should be, even for my central heating. And then when it all suddenly becomes much more kind of dynamic around me, because there's a system that needs to have the overview of it all, then I'm kind of like, I want a Ross. So I think I'll leave it there, because there's so much more that could be said about the other issues. But I just think that there's something about how people have become end designers as well as end users in that kind of parlance.
Yeah, thanks, Anne. Yes, and I think that question around the human dimensions of actually installing technology in people's homes with them, and the way that you can't just stick a smart home device in anybody's home, really, without understanding that actually it's the services and the other people and the relationships around that with people and other species and the animals as well, which is...
And I think you caught that very delicately. It's very nice.
Thank you. And so Elisa...
Yes, indeed. I think that the documentary had a lot of nuances that were really interesting. And for me, it resonated a lot. A couple of years ago, we had a project on what we call resourceful aging, looking at how to empower older people to age independently at home with Internet of Things technology. And a lot of what I've seen in the movie is such a delicate portray of this struggle of domestication. It's unclear who's domesticating what. And all of these sort of everyday hacks, what Anne just mentioned, the everyday design of appropriating the technology, the cupboard and the system around it becoming a way of doing grandparenting, rather than not so much remembering whether to take or not the medication. Those are such beautiful stories that speak, and for me the insight really is speak of how much independence is not just being able to be supported and assisted, but very much to still be able to find purpose. At some point in the movie, Hilda says, we still like to go about and do stuff to be independent, and being able to negotiate that independence without being perhaps struggling to adapt to a script that's quite narrow. I think that's the kind of multiple features you talk about in the movie that I thought it was really nice. Understanding how much are we talking here of adaptation, and how much are we talking about appropriation, and how important it is for us to start from a very positive view. And you mentioned that as well, this idea of celebrating aging as an achievement and being able to see technology perhaps not so much as a way to assist, but as a resource to continue to be able to make do and continue to design in everyday life these solutions. I think the movie made a really compelling case for that.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. Yes. And I think the way that people actually continue to design the technologies, seeing technologies as never complete, and actually their design being ongoing in those everyday worlds it was so striking how our kind of encounters with all the senior people who participated showed us that. Okay, so I'll move on to my second question. So I'll start with you again, Rama. So do you think documentary film can help us to make design more inclusive? What might be the role of a film like this in trying to make that happen?
So I'm going to quote someone who inspired me a lot as a designer, and that is someone called Sarah Pink. So I think, Sarah, your early work as a videographer, anthropologist, really brought home the idea of, I know some of it is very themed and curated in terms of the way the documentary is cut, but it brings a voice, it brings again an experience, a kind of 360 experience, and in this world of digital and non-co-located design, so when you're distant, I think the role of the documentary can be to bring to the fore issues and ideas that are changing, that are moving, that are progressing. The danger of the documentary is, of course, it's in the hands of the editor, the filmmaker. So I do want to congratulate you for presenting what does seem to be a kind of even-handed and an open-minded sort of attitude to expose, kind of commentary on seniors' attitude to technology. So I think it's incredibly important when you look at how many of the myths we have around getting older, whatever that means. I kind of liked your phrase there, Anne. There's so many myths. One of the ones that recently came up last week, for instance, and would love to see a documentary film made about this, is attitudes to environmental sustainability, that it's a younger person's game. And what that particular panel at the Design Museum came up with, run by our Design Age Institute, they basically had a author who'd spent a while researching this, and he said that older people and younger people are as likely to care about the environment, but older people, by numerical age, which is a kind of blunt tool, they're more likely to do something about it. But the media sets people up against each other. So, if I was to put something else in the documentary filmmaker basket, it would be something about the truth of attitudes to sustainability across the life stage. So yes, please, and more, please.
Wonderful. Thank you. Anne.
Yeah, I mean, and here, Rama, here to that dimension, and it did make me think that as we rely more and more on technologies to do things for ourselves, it's not just a challenge about how we use our bodies and how we continue to be engaged and how it connects us, but also how much it pins us to certain kinds of structure. And I think that there's something in there about kind of like, are we being listened to? That's really nice. There are a lot of things in there which I would love to take to a class, for instance. And it reminded me of when I last used a documentary with a group of students who were learning computer science. And they were absolutely horrified at the incompetence of the older people that they were watching. And what I really liked here is the way that you set it up with all this experience and how much life people will have lived and what they're bringing. I think that's a really lovely way of framing it. What happened with this bunch of 21-year-olds was that they were kind of a little bit dismissive. Oh, don't they know how to scroll? And, we're watching these people who can't scroll. And I said, okay, where's technology going? And how are you going to be when you're 65 or 70? And it was really amazing because everybody just kind of blanched a little bit as they suddenly realized that this is something that is endemic to the way that progress works. And it may not be for the future. We don't know what's going to happen, but certainly all the direction of travel is that there's always going to be a cohort that didn't use it at work, for whom we're kind of engaging newly. And I think you very sensitively catch that. So because it's very, as Rama was saying, very entertaining, you've got the moment when they're not sure, is it a parakeet? It's that lovely moment when you suddenly get the bird contributing as well. And I think in that way, you are able to bring in some of these aspects. And I would love to sit there and go, look, see, even cost is an issue here. So thank you.
Thanks, Anne. And Elisa?
Yeah, there is something really interesting, I think, going on between design and documentaries lately, in the sense that there have been a couple of documentaries, not as beautifully nuanced, I would say, like this one in our field, for example, like Coded Biases or The Social Dilemma, right? And even I realize in the conversations among colleagues in projects, we often wonder, should we maybe now, instead of doing an exhibition, do make a documentary to explain and expose these issues? And so there is something really powerful in the richness of the nuances that you can communicate through a documentary. And perhaps there is something to be said with respect to how much on a variety of topics these days we need to be able to sensitize, we need to be able to enter a particular type of conversation even before we get to actually designing solutions. And so that is something that I find extremely interesting. And I think your documentary is an example of that, how it can be done. And then another question that it prompted for me is also how, when you get to designing solutions, how could you use these elements in the story in a productive way? And I think that very much links to what Anne was saying, being able to bring those particular moments, particular situations that are in the documentary to the studio, to the class, to be able to use that a little bit more like a data or as a prompt for a particular type, perhaps also of ideation. So I think there is a lot of potential, and I think it's a very, very interesting development that we're seeing.
Yeah, thank you. And I guess I also, you've all been so lovely about the film and so complimentary. I also have to just emphasize again that it was so much a team effort in terms of the way the whole research team worked together and the way they worked with Kit Williams, our producer. It was an amazing experience to work with everybody in this way. And I think that everybody also brought their own area, their own expertise into the process. So I think we benefited so much from the different kind of modes of practice the whole all of the different team members brought. Okay, well, my last question, actually, I think you all started to touch on it, actually. But I will ask, and just because Rama didn't touch on it as much, and you may wish to have more to say a bit more. I think for me, one of the idea of making films like this is actually to be able to bring the experiences of real people to designers, because I think so often that kind of the opportunity to immerse yourself in the lives of other people, especially for student designers, is quite difficult to access. And my final question was, do you think that films like Smart Homes for Seniors, can they bring the voices of people who are often marginalised from design into the design studio into design teaching. Could a film like this be posed as a design challenge, to groups of students, and to really invite them to respond and to perhaps rethink some of the dominant narratives around the relationships between people and technology in a design process that this film actually invites them to undertake?
So I think a great question, a great third question. I think, films such as this could be a very positive teaching tool for introducing a new landscape of consideration to students, for people to step out of themselves and their lives, especially when you're geographically constricted, but maybe digitally enabled. And that brings with it itself some opportunities and challenges. So I think opening up the world of older people, I live, love, and breathe something called inclusive design, which is including people of all ages, abilities, genders, and races, as many as possible in your design. And, there is always that magic moment when a student sees something of, someone across the lifespan or someone with a different life experience. And that is absolute intellectual and inspirational fodder for a designer. I would say the danger is that they shouldn't stop there, because nothing can beat talking to a real person. So, films are a great way of enabling the start of a discussion. But there's 7.8 billion people on the planet. Go out and find a real person. Don't talk to a fake person on the screen. Don't make up a fake person. Go and find a real person. So if that opens the door for being able to see how you might do this, learn some of the tools, the methods, the sensitivities, I think it's a great teaching tool. But I'd also caveat that with, it's a start. It's opening up the door to a world of possibility.
Wonderful. Thank you. Anne?
Well, that was, thank you, Rami. You've said that very eloquently. In my same concern, I think it's absolutely fantastic primer, because there are so many great issues that have been reflected in the way that the storytelling works that could be teased out. But that was my first reaction, is we have to be so careful that it's seen as part of a process, because it's everybody that is under pressure to do things quicker or with less money. And as soon as you get something beautiful like this, you feel that you've got real people in the room. You're empathizing with Melissa or Yolande as if you're there at several points. And I think then we have to really be careful that it isn't projected as something that replaces learning the skills that Melissa and Yolanda have of being able to go and make, a very kind of subtle but informed investigation of what really needs to happen in context, and that the context will always be different from the one that you chose, however brilliantly you've managed to feel like you've spoken to a good range of people and covered many issues. So yes, absolutely the same point, but a good starting place.
Great, thank you, Anne. And Lisa?
Yeah, I'm thinking that, as we said before, the power of the documentary is very much in the storytelling, and that comes with the dangers just mentioned by Ram and Anne. You previously said that it was an amazing experience because of how it brought you together with the other researchers and the technologists and the institutions. And so I wonder whether, instead of looking at the documentary as an end result, if we look at it as a process of making it, and if students, for example, I'm imagining design students, were to engage in negotiating power relations within the process of telling stories. Who is telling stories? Whose perspective is that? So opening it up as a process could perhaps be an interesting way, because I think it's very powerful and quite impactful when you have to negotiate those power relations in the type of stories that you tell, rather than just going into the field and trying to, at times what I see with other students, that that power relation is not completely negotiated, because you're going in the field as a researcher, attempting to collect data for the type of work you want to do. But now if you had to tell a story together, that's a different kind of dynamic, and it could be quite interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. And I think for us, the filmmaking is always, often we learn as much through the filmmaking process itself and the research process than we can, and the product is always part of a process. And I guess what you're saying makes absolutely perfect sense. And I think that often it's sometimes about seeing the film as being in the middle of two sides of the process.
Wow.
So that the learning process that could only have happened because we were making a film, and because the camera was part of those relationships, and because the camera always invites people to show us, and we learn more and we learn differently. But then, as you said, the other side of the process is actually inviting students to think about how that might be the start of a process for them. So that's so insightful. Well, thank you all so much for your responses to my questions. We still have some time left to respond to some of the questions that have been coming in the Q&A. And the first question is from Mihaela, and who asks, what surprises you the most among the findings from the research? I can start, if you like. I can start. I mean, I think for us as a research team, it maybe wasn't a surprise, but I think one of the kind of most delightful findings was actually the deep understanding that this research gave us of that relationship between humans and technologies and animals, and how the technologies could only really become meaningful once they were embedded within those relationships. Over to Elisa.
Again, perhaps not surprising, but interesting, because it resonated a bit with some lines of research we are undertaking. At some point, I believe it was Ken said, and you were in the movie, you were discussing privacy. And Ellen, his wife, said, yes, I am concerned about Google always listening. And Ken said, I did ask the device, are you listening our conversations? And so that was a just very interesting moment in the movie, where you, to an extent, go beyond this, the domestication and enter into a quite different space that has more to do with transparency and trust, and how do you build that with an intelligent device. The tendency of looking at voice assistants as human-like, and so thinking that asking the question might actually give you an answer that is satisfying. That is an interesting design space, I believe, to address. And also an interesting research to be made. Do we actually can interview these devices? And if we can, how could we?
Mm-hmm. Yes, fantastic. And I think that the participants, they developed some really interesting ways of kind of finding out about the devices and playing with them as well. Anne?
I'm not, again, I think surprised, but it was really delightful to see, but also significant to see how people adapt. I was really struck by a lot of, Elisa's just referred to the kind of question that was posed to the device about being listened to. And I was really struck by, obviously, Google has thought long and hard about how to answer that one, because it was the longest and most kind of erudite of all the messages that came back, very thought through. And yes, it is listening. It just isn't reporting. So really interesting. But the thing that struck me in these dialogues that were going on is that initially you've got this kind of delay problem because they don't immediately respond, and sometimes the language isn't perfect. I've got colleagues at Sussex who are working on a kind of more free text way of speaking to your devices so that they are able to cope with jug and kettle. But it really struck me again, with some delight, but also just kind of some consternation, just how adaptable the human, kind of spirit is when it is confronted by something that's going to do something. And just what a fantastically intrepid group of people you had here who were kind of going into this world where strange voices were going to be coming out of gadgets but not coming out, or how many times they had to say light 2, bathroom light 2, and then how that actually works. So for me, that was both a joy and also a reminder that we can't take that for granted, because that is something that diminishes with age, or certainly as one, particularly with frailty. I think we need to separate the idea of frailty from age, actually, because the two do not correlate.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Rama.
So I've gone last, so I can actually have some time to think. But no, what really struck me was the reinforcing of a digital etiquette, and you start to see that sort of unfolding in front of you of people having to learn new ways of saying things, but actually the uptake was pretty sharp. So it was that thing of, lowering the entry point and actually showing the meaning. Why are you doing this? Why is that light coming on your kitchen counter and linked to your medication? And there was that sort of wonderful moment where the husband and wife were talking to each other, and she was explaining to him, you've got to say Google first, then Roomba. And I just thought it would be, I don't know if you've shown this to Google or tech companies, but they're also the people that can really learn from seeing how people use, abuse, fail, love, live, and learn with these technologies that are often designed in a little bit of isolation or quite a lot of isolation. And it just reminds me of one of the very first things we did with a major mobile phone manufacturer back in the day was give them sort of 25 UK pounds. So it's about, 40 US dollars. And say to them, just as a way of getting them to understand their users, customers, the people that they're designing for, we said to them, go out and buy one of your own mobile phones, set it up, and ring me in an hour. None of them managed it. And it was that whole thing of, where do your phones come from? Well, the tech department set it up for me, but my grandmother, my mother doesn't have a tech department. It's called me. So that simple understanding, I think, that the film could bring about tech use, about language, the etiquette of introduction and the etiquette of use, I think was really powerful.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I think we would love the film to have impact in those areas as well. I think that there's one thing actually that you all made me think of as well when you were talking about the way that people were engaging with the technology, which was also the wonderful moment when Beryl referred to manners and the wanting to say please and thank you, and that the voice assistant wasn't really interested in communicating along kind of the please and thank you lines. Which is lovely as well. Okay, so I have another question here from Jeanette, who says that the women in the film were better with the technologies than the men. And is this a common theme in this age group? And I know that you all have expertise in doing work with this age group, and I'd love to hear your insights there. It might be a question that's impossible to answer in a very general sense. But while you're thinking about it, I guess this we did make a comment in the narration, which I should also say the narration was a joint effort between our team rather than just my thoughts. But we did make the comment about digital housekeeping, and I think the way that the use of many technologies might become part of the routines and the roles and the domestic tasks that women were doing already, which for me is a kind of interesting way of explaining how women might seem to be better at using the technologies, because perhaps that's where they have actually interpreted that their they've been more able to interpret whether some of those technologies can actually fit into their everyday routines that they were responsible for performing, according to, very particular interpretations and experiences of gender roles. But of course, gender is very diverse and gender roles vary across many contexts as well. So Elisa.
I'm not sure I'm going to be able to answer the question. I don't have insights, but one thing that I have noticed in the documentary is that there seems to be a different communication style between the way in which men and women relate to the device, at least in the documentary. And because there is a lot of trial and error in figuring out how you have to speak to the technology, it seemed to me like the women in the documentary were just adopting a slightly different communication style that perhaps allowed them to figure out things through iteration a little bit more easily. There was the episode where I think he was between men and wife. I think it was Beryl and Ken, and she was scolding him for how he was addressing the device in a rude way, and that of course might have to bring us into a different conversation, but it might also be interpreted in terms of being a little bit more open to try different ways of saying it until it works, and versus instead just giving the command and expecting it to work right away. That's what I observed. So I keep it at that level.
Yeah. Okay, Rama.
And I think I'm going to follow you and talk about what I observed, but also what we've observed across the work that we've done. And, things are changing as gender identity becomes, more fluid, more kind of discussed. And, the World Health Organization at the last count had over 50 different gender identifiers. One of our students came up with 122. So I think, bearing in mind, answering this question from a very sort of binary point of view, what we see is that in that particular age group, and I'm kind of assuming late 70s into the 80s here, is, there were quite gendered roles historically, which meant that, as a form of communication, even with a robot or a Roomba or a Google, we see that, women of that generation are more likely to enter into communication, even research communication, than men of that age group who might have identified a little bit more with, job or professional role. And it's just a reflection on the film. In the introductions, I noticed the camera was, in two instances, was focusing on the wife, who then introduced her husband, and the men were a little bit more reticent. So there's just a reflection point here rather than any wisdom coming from me of, I just wonder whether that sort of communication with human beings, that communication that we see more naturally coming to the females in this age group, whether that also translates into technology and also researchers who reach out to people. Because when we reach out to communities, we get more responders who identify as female. One of the men who did respond did say, when you get to the 80s, there's 3 times as many women in his community groups as men, because maybe women are outlasting men. To which he then added, it's a great time to be on the dating scene in your 80s and be an older man, because you have a pool that's 3 times bigger than yourself. So I'll just leave you with that, comment on elder dating.
Wonderful.
I think it's really important, and as everyone has been referring to, the kind of cohort effect of it being a particular group and at a particular time And of course, you will have much more insight into how they really were to some extent, Sarah, because as the director, and we've had an editor actually making the story whiz along rather than kind of much of the interaction that would probably be very revealing. So I wouldn't want to comment on what I'm seeing particularly. But I do think that, I mean, when we were doing some aging research with older people in the East End of London, when you talked about sewing machines, one group of people lit up. When you talked about kind of heavy industry, another group of people lit up. And you could see that in gender lines. So there were things that people became authoritative about because of their life experience. And I think the fact that you were able to show the sort of journey of ideal, you know, who is it going to serve, when you actually reference the fact that it was kind of women's work and men's entertainment, I think, you know, perhaps the legacy of that is still with the people that we were seeing. So that's really important. But it also speaks of why we have to remake these, not just because the technology is changing, but because the culture is changing. And of course, what you see in regional and rural New South Wales would probably be different in central Melbourne, or different in Zimbabwe, or different down the road where I'm living in Brighton. So, you know, we can only really situate this stuff and be very mindful that even though it tells something which is a broad story, it's for its time and it's for its place. So I think you capture that. So it's not at all a criticism, but I think it's an answer to what we can say about what we're seeing.
Thanks, Anne. Thank all of you for those insights around gender and change. So we've got time for one more question. And this is a question from Peter. Who says that one obvious issue to him, having watched the film and also having had his own experiences with his mother, is what he calls the inconsistencies of language between various manufacturers. And he asks if can this be overcome? Because if it can't, the technology will be very limited to specific functions. So I guess we're kind of thinking towards, you know, what kind of design, as designers, I guess I would pose that question to you, kind of around the idea of, you know, what would be the best way to think of a more connected smart home environment that was also appropriate for seniors and that we could easily live with and adapt in the way that people have in the film? That's a big question. Rama is already ready to answer it, though.
There's two quick points, if I may. One is, leaning into the conversational tone. When we were working with Samsung, one of their challenges, they came to us and said, design a phone that we can sell to older people. And in there, we saw a kind of, more salubrious brief, which was, let's understand what's going on. And this was in 2007. And we realized most mobile phone manufacturers were writing manuals that were written by lawyers, and maybe there was one or two engineers there. And one of the things we did was to rewrite the manual as a book, because again, the cohort effect that Anne was talking about, 13 years ago was very much in effect. So it was more of a book, which is a technology people understand. And instead of using SMS, it was saying, messaging. And we did a piece of research where there was this Canadian daughter-in-law. There was an English lady who would take all of her technology in her bag to Canada because her daughter-in-law would have the patience to walk her through it. And when we were able to film that, the Canadian daughter-in-law became the gold standard for how you interact with your technology, because she said things like, what if there was anywhere in the world you could send me a little message, just a sentence that would reach me wherever my phone is on, and I could read it under the table in the meeting. And the lady said, this is amazing. And she said, yeah, that's called an SMS, but it's really just a message. And it was just that sort of thing. And I think the final, just the other point is, right now we're involved in a project that's called Vocal Accessibility, that's actually looking at, I hate the word, but I kind of love the word, but a standard exactly in this area of, I'm sort of reminded of driving here. And it wasn't until Cadillac in the 1920s or 30s basically said, clutch, brake, accelerator, and you steer with a steering wheel, because the Model T at the time, you were steering with a lever, and standardized that and said, this is what works for human beings. Of course, there's a lot of challenges with standards, but there's something there that we haven't discovered. It's still the Wild West, in my opinion.
Thank you. Anne and Elisa, is there something you'd like to add?
Yeah, I mean, this, for me, it just screams of something about interoperability, which I think Ram is already alluding to, both in terms of standards and vocabulary. But I think we can just see that as something which is a challenge for this industry still at this point anyway. And when I was working with Claire Rowland, we wrote a book called Designing Connected Products. And so this was already 6 years ago now. And we were trying to speak of this stuff. And I mention it because we had to sort of be creating the vocabulary to talk about this stuff at the time. Even the title was kind of like, do we use Internet of Things? Is it going to last long enough? How do we explain this stuff? Is it going to be meaningful to people, to designers, to people using this stuff? And we were talking about also the idea of interusability. What happens when all these things come together and we have to make them work and they have to talk to each other? And I think we're at a point when a huge vocabulary still needs to be developed, because in the 6 years since, I don't see that having sorted itself out at all. But I also think that if you get into one regime, working with one supplier, at the moment, you're still in a position where you will probably never venture to anybody else, because not only are the challenges about learning a whole new vocabulary, but we don't even have systems that can entirely interoperate. So it's almost like we have a first problem to solve, which is how do we just make this accessible and easy on the market? And then, with that, how do we speak about this stuff?
Yes, exactly. Thank you. Elisa, would you like to add anything?
Yes, I think that once we get there, Ram and Anne made a very good picture of where we are now. Once we are there and we have a vocabulary that has been standardized, I think the next step is to consider the language, not just the instructions, but also the way in which we interact with this technology and how we make sense of it. And so the interplay between how we might use it and make it work in connection to each other. And so I'm thinking, for example, of one of the solutions that we attempted to adopt in the Resourceful Agent project was to work dimensions of openness and dimensions of closure in a way such that this family of connected resources, which were actually very recombinable set of sensors and actuators for everyday hacks, that you could actually find a sweet spot in between what you need to know, how familiar they need to be, how easy they need to be able to be deployed, and how instead you can make up, invent and improvise the ways in which they speak to each other, and the way in which they work in together for you in particular circumstances. And so I think that as we consolidate the standardization moving forward in understanding that the language is more than the interoperability and interusability, and it also has a lot to do with these dimensions of variety across different practices, that I think will also be quite important and critical.
Wonderful. Thank you, all of you very much. So we're coming to a close now. And so just to conclude then, I'd like to thank all of our panelists your fantastic comments and for joining us this morning and this evening. I'd also like to thank the team, the Monash team, for organising this event today. Follow us at the Emerging Tech Lab on Twitter, Emerging Tech Research Lab on Facebook, and Monash Infotech on Facebook and Twitter as well. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. Thank you so much to our whole research team for making this work possible. And more than anything, thank you so much to all the people who participated in our research and in the film itself for actually enabling us to bring this to you today. Thank you very much, and good night and good morning. I hope everyone has a wonderful evening and a wonderful day.